Hello and welcome once again. My name is John Van Etten. I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics Office in Germany, taking care of the DACH region of Europe, as well as quite a bit of Eastern Europe and so on. Welcome again to one of our webinars. The topic for today is survey fatigue. So this is a common question that we receive from clients as well as accredited practitioners when they're considering using human synergistics instruments, oftentimes in addition to other surveys and questionnaires that they're providing to their employees. And the question really is along the line, should we be concerned about survey fatigue? The idea that people are kind of getting a little overwhelmed with the number of surveys that they're receiving and may be less likely to answer those surveys, maybe less careful in how they answer the questions, simply because of the sheer volume of surveys that people are receiving. I do talk to a lot of organizations. I do know that most of those that I speak with not only use one or two surveys or questionnaires, but actually quite a few, perhaps even four or five different assessments or questionnaires that they use on an annual basis. So the topic of survey fatigue is a valid one in some ways to discuss. So I'll start there. My personal opinion for many years has been that I don't really believe in survey fatigue. I believe in inaction fatigue. And I was actually very heartened before this webinar. I did a few searches online and have found very much the same kind of feedback from many other directions and other survey providers and organizations as well, meaning that the real issue in terms of people being overwhelmed and tired of answering surveys has little to do with the surveys and more to do with the fact that the organizations and their leadership are not acting upon the results of those surveys, and employees get the perception that even though we take our time to answer these things honestly, action is not taken. And again, especially if we consider the idea of people being asked to answer these surveys typically on an annual basis, engagement is a lovely example of this. Then, we're being asked every year, every 6 months, how engaged we are, but we're not seeing any action or changes in the organization as a result of this. So it really isn't survey fatigue. It really is inaction fatigue. It really is, in my opinion, a frustration based on the employees and the members of the business that, again, even though we're taking our time to answer these questions and do so honestly, it's not resulting in any kind of change. And therefore, with time, people begin to learn that this is wasted time and effort, and they begin to then not answer the surveys, and then the organization will of course see lower and lower response rates to those surveys, and I believe this is very much the reason why. There's other wonderful statistics, not from human synergistics, but you can find in other areas that actually find that if you ask employees, they would prefer to respond to more surveys. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but in a lot of ways, employees like to be heard. They want to be listened to. They want their voices to be heard. And I think it's somewhere, I think it was 58% of employees in the most recent survey. I'm not sure how broad that was, but actually report that they wish that they could voice their opinions more frequently through these kinds of confidential surveys. We also find that, and this is also found independently, that simply including employees in surveys actually can help promote things like engagement. We know, and one of the things I've oftentimes talked about in organizations is when we think about organizational culture, over my shoulder here, that's influenced by various factors in organizational climate. One of those factors in climate that is typically one of the most influential factors is what's called employee involvement. The extent to which employees are listened to, heard from, their voices count, and they're included in important decisions in the organization. And really, if you think about it, asking people important, relevant questions in a survey is including them. And many times I like to talk to accredited practitioners and make the point that in many cases, when we talk about using human synergistics tools for the purpose of culture development, you're actually changing culture, you're actually affecting culture the moment that you build a project and launch that project, because depending on the number of employees that you include in the project, the sample size, that is employee involvement. And it really does make a difference when people understand that they're being asked questions like, what is the current culture and what do you feel is expected of you versus what should be taking place in this organization? What would you prefer? Those kinds of questions, people actually like to be heard, and do in fact benefit from that, and the culture benefits from asking and listening to their people. So again, I don't really believe much in survey fatigue. I think it has a lot to do with inaction fatigue, as again has been noted by others in the area. The other point I would make is that I do get the question around the survey fatigue before we conduct projects with clients. So the surveys that we have do have many questions within them. They do take a bit of time, typically 15 to 20 minutes to answer those surveys. So I do get questions from clients fairly often beforehand in terms of, is it really worth the time investment? Is it really worth the employees taking their time? Is it really worth, pulling everyone away from their work for 15 minutes to answer the surveys? Again, I get that question quite frequently before we conduct projects. I think I've been with Human Synergistics for about 15 years, maybe a little more than that. I have never received that question or any feedback in that direction after the project has been completed, or after, in other words, after the client receives the reports and data. Meaning it may seem unclear as to whether the investment is really worth it, 15 minutes of our employees' time beforehand. But once we deliver the kinds of reports and data and clarity that we do provide clients, I have never had a client come back and say, I don't feel like it was worth the investment. I've actually never heard of a single participant coming back and complaining about the fact that they had to take part in the survey or were invited to do so. In my experience, I really don't have ever found the kinds of consequences that a lot of organizations seem to be concerned about, again, on the front end of projects. So maybe that's another helpful point. Another point I like to make is that if you're familiar with Human Synergistics tools, and especially things like the instruments that we provide at the organizational and culture level, another point I like to make is that oftentimes we can replace several other surveys that the organization is already conducting. A good example of this are things like engagement surveys, or surveys around diversity and inclusion and psychological safety and adaptability and so on. Many times the kinds of questions that are being asked in those global employee surveys and so on can be incorporated into our organizational level tools, specifically and primarily with regard to customizing outcome questions, and again, building in those specific questions that the organization has been asking around engagement and diversity, inclusion, and so on. So this allows us to provide one survey that really incorporates not only what we're offering, but other pieces of information as well. In the experiences that I've done this, it's typically been very positive for two reasons. One, we have sort of one moment to sit down and answer the survey and go through those questions. And that includes not only the HS questions, but also some of those from our global employee survey or whatever it may be, so that you sort of do this once rather than, every few months employees having to take yet another survey, pull that all together into one. Another benefit to this is that often allows us to do some specialized data analysis on not only the culture of the organization and how that drives outcomes, but how that culture is influencing the customized specific outcomes of the organization. So this is oftentimes a whole nother level of input for the leadership in the business, because again, many cases we've been asking those engagement questions for years. We've never particularly been satisfied with the results. Maybe even those scores have been going down, and we don't really understand why that's happening or what needs to change in the business to have a positive effect. Again, by building those questions into our larger framework, which is not only reliable and valid, but a causal framework. So we can not only give you the data that you've been receiving on how engaged your people may be, but we can begin to give you much more, I think, helpful information about why they are engaged to the extent that they are, why those scores have been going down historically, and what specifically needs to change within the organization in order to promote engagement. So there's a real benefit to incorporating those other surveys we may have been asking into an instrument like the OCI, not only to simplify this for your employees and streamline the process, but also to give you much more useful, actionable, and in-depth data. Okay. The last point then I typically make, so again, survey fatigue, I don't really believe is survey fatigue. I always ask clients when they are concerned about survey fatigue, honestly, I've historically asked them how many other surveys they're asking, how many other questions they ask. And then my next question is how many of those surveys and questions do they follow up on and create action with? What I typically find is the organizations, again, that are concerned about survey fatigue and have experienced it, it's less that they're asking questions and more that they're failing to take action or create any change based on those questions, which again, over time, teaches your people firstly, that we don't act on this information, so it becomes sort of less logical for them to take their time to do that. And I also have to make the additional point that I think it's actually quite negative to do this, because I believe it begins to teach your employees not only that we don't take action, but it teaches your employees sort of not to listen to leadership in the organization. We say we're interested in diversity and inclusion. We ask you to take time to answer those questions, but we do nothing to act upon that and create change. And that very much has multiple negative consequences for your people and especially for the organization's culture. I even extend that to human synergistics tools as well. If clients are interested in using these instruments, but I get the sense that they're not prepared or don't intend to act on the results and to do something with it, I've even refused to do projects with clients because you're not helping your people. You're continuing to create and reinforce a negative sense that they have about their value in the organization, whether they're actually heard, whether their voices count, whether they can trust and listen to leadership, a variety of things. And I don't think we as HS or I want to be involved in furthering that kind of negative sense of employees. That's not what these tools are for. Our tools are for, certainly not what our business is about. Okay. Again, other benefits, then again, it's really, again, not survey fatigue also, because we're talking about 15 minutes. If we have multiple surveys that we're asking people over months, then let's pull those together into one session. They'll take 15 or 20 minutes to answer those questions. But again, we'll give you much more information, actionable information. And again, I've never heard after a project that was just too much to answer, or that the questions that we asked were not somehow quite relevant and useful thereafter, and thus absolutely worth the time and cost investment in doing the project. All right, now for those of you who are accredited, then I'll switch to the last topic, which is if we are concerned about survey fatigue, and there are some legitimate concerns, how can we best deal with that, especially for projects which are quite large? And I'm referring primarily to things like culture projects where we may be administering more than one survey. In many cases, we're administering a survey to ask questions around what is the current culture and how is that affecting our well-being and performance across a variety of outcomes. And we oftentimes are administering a secondary survey, asking questions around what should the culture be, what do we want taking place here, what is ideal, appropriate, and consistent with our values, so that the organization and its leadership can understand these things and also directly compare what's currently happening in the business to what we describe and say should be taking place. So in that case, there are several questions, and we are talking about 2 surveys. Typically, we administer both of those surveys within one project. That would typically be a 3 to 4 week period of data collection in which people are invited to answer the current culture survey first. Again, that takes 15 minutes. Once they've completed that, then they receive an invitation to move on and answer the ideal version of the survey, typically 24 hours later. In any case, we can easily do both of those assessments within 3 weeks, 4 weeks of data collection, and typically have very good response rates between 70 and 80% from the organization. A variety of reasons we get very good response rates, including the fact that the surveys are administered externally directly from Human Synergistics, which guarantees and ensures confidentiality of your people, which makes them feel more comfortable and also ensures not only that they answer the survey, but they do so very honestly and consistently. So if we're administering multiple surveys in a 3 to 4 week timeline, how might we try to reduce survey fatigue when we think about individuals needing to answer each of those surveys? So there are two basic methods for this. The first is to simply administer different project timelines, meaning we will launch a project and simply ask the current culture questions in this project. Then close the project, generate the reports, even deliver those reports to the accredited practitioner, and then allow for some time before we set up another project and ask the secondary questions around the ideal against which, again, we can compare the current. So simply breaking this up across multiple projects over a time period is pretty simple way to reduce the fatigue of sort of having to answer one survey and then within a week or two, jump into the second one. I will also point out that with our instruments, there's no need to answer the entire survey at once. Each individual's invitation has a unique login. Therefore, when I log into the survey and I can answer half of the questions, and if I feel fatigued, I can stop, take a break, come back the next day or 2 days later, click on the same link, log right back in, and complete the survey. So a lot of surveys don't function that way, but since we have unique logins coded for each individual, they can log back into their survey and continue. So there's no need for them, if they feel fatigued at any point during that 15 to 20 minutes, to push through. They can take a break. So that helps as well. Another way that we can deal with survey fatigue, again, if that's a serious concern, is with what we call split sampling. So this is where we would have two different groups of people answering the current culture questions versus the ideal. So when we think about best practices, and I think there's a webinar somewhere of me talking about sampling and how we advise clients determine their samples for the organization, basically who's going to be included in the survey, who's going to take part. If you watch that video, I think you'll see at the very beginning, I make a fairly good argument for, of course, 100% sample is a best practice for a variety of reasons, not only for the quality and detail of the data, but also for the point I made earlier of making all of your people feel included in and heard in this kind of assessment. And that's particularly helpful and effective for the ideal description I've found, as we ask employees what should be going on here, what kind of work environment they would like to work within, is a very, very positive question to ask, and the kind of thing people really want to take part in. Again, assuming that the organization and its leadership is going to hear and act upon that information and hopefully guide the business in the direction that the employees are describing. That's something that people actually really enjoy taking part in. But in any case, if we are, again, concerned about that and want to reduce the number of surveys that people need to answer, one way is to simply split the sample, meaning instead of each employee answering firstly the current culture questions and then secondarily answering the ideal, we can split your population essentially in two and have half of your people answer the current culture questions and the other half answer the ideal, and pull all of this together. Now, there are some consequences to this, especially when we start looking at correlation analyses, which I won't get into at this point. Again, I talk about those consequences in the sampling webinar. So there are some consequences to it. However, what it does do is allow your people to simply answer one survey rather than having to come back and answer two. So. Good. So those were my primary points. Again, survey fatigue, I suppose, is a thing, but I think much more often it's sort of the term that we use instead of saying what is really happening, which is inaction fatigue. I've never run into an organization that is concerned about survey fatigue and feels like they've experienced it, who will then tell me that we do take action on the surveys and the feedback that we receive. It always seems to be we're worried about survey fatigue and we think we're experiencing it. And yes, we're asking surveys, but we're also not acting on those surveys and not putting those changes and learnings into action. And I think that's what is very dangerous. Again, we can also simplify this for your people by pulling multiple surveys into one, so that we're administering one instrument at one time, rather than asking people to take part in several surveys over several months. And that all not only helps your people to feel less fatigued, but also gives you more useful and actionable data. And then, of course, finally, if we really end up with a project and do want to avoid people answering more than one survey, there are ways to split those samples. Again, it comes down to some sampling questions like the size of the overall organization, the smallest subgroups that you intend to break out within those reports, because with culture projects, right, we can create subgroups and we need representative samples. So when we start splitting those samples, we start to have some concerns about needing to make sure that we have enough data. And also we start to lose some of our detail in things like correlation analyses, because we don't have the same people answering the questions throughout the entire model. So it becomes a little harder to find those causal threads that are from culture to outcomes and so on and so forth. But again, that kind of project design is something that we can do, and is a nice way to address and reduce the concerns around survey fatigue. All right, I think those were the points that I had. I hope that is helpful. Again, please have a look online. I noticed several other actually very good videos and content on survey fatigue that matched up with a lot of these points as well. So hope this is helpful and consistent with other sources.